about to learn about MIMIC-IV-on-FHIR with Alex Bennett.
All right, thanks. My talk today is going through MIMIC-IV and converting it into FHIR, and I'll go through what MIMIC is and that process into FHIR and walk you through all that. And I guess who I am, I'm a research software engineer at the Kind Lab at the Hospital for Sick Children, and this is associated with U of T as well, University of Toronto, so right outside of, right in Toronto. And just acknowledging some collaborators on the work, my lab itself, and some researchers out of Germany in Lübeck, and the FHIR community for answering questions on chat.fhir. And so in this talk, I'm going through different, the learning objectives are to sort of first familiarize ourselves with MIMIC itself, and then understanding the conversion process going from MIMIC to FHIR, which involves some profiling, mapping, validation, and export, and then a demo of actually using MIMIC-IV-on-FHIR. So what is MIMIC? It's the Medical Information Mart for intensive care, and this is a Boston hospital, basically all their EHR pulled out and de-identified. So we've got over 300,000 de-identified critical care patients. So there's a lot of really rich data in MIMIC, and it's been used for a lot of retrospective analysis in its structured format. So it's a Postgres database that can be used currently. And so really it's currently accessible real-world data that has been de-identified. And so the complete MIMIC database is accessible with full credentials from PhysioNet online, as well as there's a demo data set accessible with open credentials, so you can just start using it. And so what MIMIC looks like is you've got a couple different modules. And so it looks like a patient going through your hospital system. So you've got MIMIC Core, which is the patient itself and the demographic and information about them there. Then they come into the emergency room and you're triaging, collecting some vital signs, and then they might be transferred into the ICU, or they might just go home from there. And in the ICU, you've got a lot of charted events, you've got different medication administrations, and throughout that process, we're collecting, MIMIC-IV here collects a lot of the diagnostics, and the labs, the microbiology are all stored in there. And then we've got MIMIC-CXR is a newer one where it's collecting just DICOM imaging data. And so that part we haven't translated into FHIR right now, but a lot of these components. And so if we look at just that patient story going through, in MIMIC, we've got the ED where you've got the triaging and getting the medical history. And so there's individual tables storing that ED information, as well as when it's transferred into the ICU, there's a lot of procedures, charted events, drug administrations, and then during that stay, as I mentioned, many different labs and billing codes. And so we're really going to focus on MIMIC Hosp and ICU because that's where a lot of the core data is, and wanting to get that into. And so I guess what was our motivation to convert it? I guess we're all here at FHIR DevDays. There's just the 21st Century Cures Act in the States is just pushing everything into FHIR. There's so much development worldwide. It's just growing. US, Europe, Australia are really pushing. And real world data sets are needed for development and testing. So they give you a lot of rich data that can tell you about different edge cases. And there's other great software out there like Cynthia for some testing, but I really think that MIMIC provides another level past that. And the goals while converting MIMIC to FHIR was to preserve the content of MIMIC into the FHIR format, so trying to keep it as true as it is from that EHR, as well as preserving the terminology because there was such a robust terminology in MIMIC originally, as well as capturing the majority of our information in profiles based on US core as much as possible, and in some cases that wasn't, and then we added extensions or built off of base FHIR. And so our workflow for this conversion was first building up an implementation guide, going through FHIR generation from the database to FHIR, and then going through validation and export. And so if we look first into this kind of implementation guide, this breaks into kind of two main components. You've got all these profiles we're creating and a lot of terminology because of the robust terminology in a lot of these EHRs. And so we've created an implementation guide, Mimic Profiles, that captures this terminology. And that's where in these profiles we're binding to all these terminology systems that we've created. And at this stage, this is more of a capturing it as is. So we're skipping some of the business logic and ontology mapping because that's a huge, there's a lot of concept maps that need to be made, and that'll be a subsequent step moving forward. And so the generation of terminology kind of looks like this, where we've got on the left, we've got these MIMIC schemas, and they're feeding in, we've got it all in Postgres, and so feeding it into SQL scripts to kind of pull out your codes, your displays, and what your final code systems will be. And we created a support Python package, PyMimicFire, that would output these terminology systems, because it's really just converting a CSV into code systems. And so capturing 20 odd code systems and pumping them out to the other side where we've got the terminology. And so that terminology was then paired with the profiles where we were binding to those different value sets, and we used FHIR shorthand to do this. I don't know if anyone's gone to the talks yet, but it is a great programmatic way to do your profiling. It is much quicker and much easier, and Sushi allows you, is the program that allows you to use FHIR shorthand and output an implementation guide, and it's very quick and easy to get it up and running, and so would highly recommend. And so that's what we use to do this profiling and binding of the terminology to those profiles. And so at this point, we have a Mimic implementation guide that can be used to validate our to validate our resources coming out of the database. And so an example here, this is just kind of showing more profiling, where you're just saying this category comes from observation category, and you've got a value set it's pointing to, and you've got the code system that contains it. And so at this point, you've got a lot of these value sets and code systems that are completely captured in the code system. So that's something, again, that will need to be either left or concept mapped to more standard FHIR. And so at this point, we've kind of got a profile view of MimicFire, where we've got your patient and your encounters splitting into more of our general hospital information and then our ICU-specific information. And so I've shown a profile view just to show you all the information that we've captured, but if you're pulling from observations, there'd be 10 odd profiles that are pulled in, but they're all still observations at the end of the day. And yeah, so we've got lots of medication information coming through different specimen labs. So a lot of really rich information coming through there. Don't know what that was on the screen. And so at this point, we've got our implementation guide that can be used on our FHIR server to help with validation and conversion. And so we have to go through the process of mapping Mimic to FHIR. So this is the kind of more manual process of taking those Mimic columns and matching up to FHIR elements, as well as making sure that terminology matches when you're doing that, as well as looking to capture some more complex data into FHIR. So this is where you've got multiple sources of medication, which you might see in many EHRs, as well as microbiology data, which is a headache to deal in most standard systems. And so this mapping process is fairly straightforward here, where you've got your MIMIC table, lab events, and you map across identifiers to an observation lab events, as well as you'll have certain terminology bindings for something like an item ID or certain flags across there. And so that's kind of just a high-level look at the mapping process that was done for all these different tables. And so I wanted to walk through a couple examples to kind of show like what the data was in MIMIC and kind of sort of our thought process in some of this mapping out here. So these are three kind of tables in MIMIC: admissions, transfers, and HCPCS events. And this is for a patient that came into the emergency department. They were admitted and then transferred into the transplant ward, and then maybe moved beds in the transplant ward, so that's why they show up twice, and then they were discharged. And so we've got some useful information going on here where the patient is transferring between different locations, but often in the encounter resource, you have only one, like you can maybe capture each transfer as an encounter, but then are you gaining more information across that? Because each transfer doesn't have that much information. So how to kind of store the transfer in encounter, as well as where to put some of these HCPCS codes. And so what we decided to do is to capture the care units as locations, so that emergency department and transplant location, those are all captured as locations and then stored in the encounter.location array. And so this gives you kind of a history as the patient is going through, where they could go from a transplant floor to a cardiology floor. So you could have them going through each of those, and you'd have the story in kind of one central encounter. And these care units as locations give you a bit of a hierarchy of the hospital. And so the CPT codes are the main codes that we were able to pull in, and you can pull multiple of those in to the encounter type. Another one, as I kind of alluded to, was microbiology mapping. There's a lot of very interesting information, but it's many leveled and tiered, where you've got a patient with a microspecimen ID, which you've got like a urine culture test, and then you could have multiple organisms like E. coli, Citrobacter, and then you're testing all these different antibiotics and their different results to susceptibility. And so how do we store this in FHIR is the question here, and how to get all those individual results without repeating a lot of information. You don't want to create a result that has the urine culture, E. coli, ampicillin. You want to be able to pull out that one test and see its connections. And so we kind of created this tiered observation microtest that then points to microorganisms, that points to microsusceptibility. So then you could kind of pull out your observation microtest and get its connecting components. And so this we thought was a really useful way to look at the microbiology, and there's discussions online on chat.fire and whatnot, pointing to this as a potential solution, but there haven't been as many implementations looking at microbiology, so this is useful for people to potentially play in their FHIR systems. And kind of the last one in MIMIC, one of the big struggles was medication mapping, where you've got kind of multiple sources coming in. You've got prescriptions that the doctor has prescribed, and then you've got the pharmacy where they're dispensing it, and then you've got the EMR where they're actually giving you and administering it. And so here, this is a transplant drug, antithymoxate globulin, and it also comes with heparin and hydrocortisone. So all of this is kind of paired together, but then it's administered as one. And so in FHIR, a lot of the medication resources only want you to point to one medication. And so that's a bit of a struggle here when it goes from having potentially 4 medications to saying, oh, we just dispensed one and administered one. What are we kind of supposed to do in this situation? And so for that kind of prescription problem, we saw it in about 14% of the prescriptions that came through in MIMIC. And so this maybe is the legacy data that is causing some of this difference here of the prescription and the administration not fully matching up, but we still need a solution. And so we created a medication resource with ingredients pointing to each of the individual drugs. And so you would point to this medication, and it would encompass all those drugs as you're administering it. And so the kind of the medication view goes from a medication request to dispense to the administration, and that main medication request is pointing to that maybe complex medication, and then simplified for now, we have just a medication codable concept that points to the one-line codes. And so there's kind of a matchup between this medication and medication codable concept. And so the medication is always a complex thing to map in an EHR. And so we've given a couple components here that aren't fully in US core that I've seen. The medication administration wasn't there, so we've kind of built it up off the base FHIR. And yeah, so that's kind of the medication and kind of the big global view of all the tables that have been mapped across. This is just high level to show all the information and tables that are there. And so I'll let you guys look at that later, but we can get to kind of the final step and then maybe playing with the data. So at this point, we've kind of mapped everything over, and we've kind of got this raw MimicFire, and so we now want to validate it against our implementation guide and make sure it's valid FHIR and everything, because we've done a lot of this mapping in SQL. And we did that out of convenience and speed, to be honest. And so we still want to make sure this is all valid FHIR. And I briefly mentioned MimicFire, but we built it up to support some of this validation and export, just to really connect with the database in the FHIR server and kind of send bundles to be validated and collect them back when they're exported. So this is just a really nice support function or support package that we created. And so the kind of validation process here was looking at taking that MimicFire that we had created in SQL and running it through MimicFire, sending it to the FHIR server, which had been stood up with our implementation guide, and then exporting some ND-JSONs. And so if we dig a little bit into the validation, what we get is basically sending bundle requests to a FHIR server. In our case, it was HAPI FHIR, and HAPI FHIR had the MIMIC profiles on there, and it would resolve and say, okay, do we have the right MIMIC patient profile, MIMIC encounter, and if it's valid, send it back, and it's good. We've created valid FHIR, and if not, make some corrections, basically. And from that FHIR server, we use MimicFire to communicate and export these resource binaries back out and store them as ND-JSON so they could be distributed and other people could start potentially using them. And so at this phase, we've got MIMIC to FHIR converted. We've gone through implementation guide, conversion, generation, and that final validation and export. And so we have actually today, we got it published on PhysioNet, so it's out there and accessible. I'll have a link at the end of this slide deck, and I might even post it into WOVA because it wasn't on the original slide deck because we just got it today. And so let's dive into actually just playing with a little bit of the data and seeing what we've got going. And so to play with the data, I wanted to start by we set up using Pathlink, which is a analytic FHIR server put out by CSIRO, by the Australian government. And it's a handy FHIR server that has built in extra functionality to do some more analytics, some aggregation, and some extra ability to extract information into tabular formats. And so it's just a useful demonstration tool. And so that's why we built up kind of a tutorial workbook using the MimicFire resources and the FHIR server. But I will mention that we are developing a HAPI FHIR tutorial, just using MimicFire as well, just to get people up and running. But basically, these resources are, not there, but are basically just ND-JSONs that you can go to and download. So if we go to, this is the publication, and you just basically get down to the bottom of files, sign off and say that you're good to use the data, and won't let me get into there, but yeah, so we've got all the ND-JSONs here that can be downloaded to play with and start going there. And so now we've got our Pathlink server up and running, and we can jump over to a little tutorial. You don't need to see the screen too much here. I'm going to be making some graphs as I go through here, so it should enlarge in there, but this notebook is available online as well, and I have that linked in the article. And so basically you would you start running through here and run through the first step of importing the resources, and I've preloaded them because it takes about 5 minutes, and we don't need to sit here waiting for that, but it takes about 5 minutes because we're looking at a demo data set of 100 patients, but it has over 800,000 resources because you got so many observation chart events, microbiology events. Like, it's really in-depth, rich data, but it sounds funny to say 100 patients takes that long, but we've got so many resources we're loading in at that point. And so, yeah, we've got this step to import it, and then there's potential search functionalities, which I'll come back to, but I wanted to dive into aggregating and looking at this data. And so one of the first things, this could be if you're looking at a cohort analysis or whatnot, you might start looking through the data and wanting to see the gender or conditions, whatnot. And so if we start looking at something like gender, we can get a split and see, okay, we've got about a 60-40 split in the patient data. If we start looking at conditions, I'm just going to grab the top 15 here, and we can see kind of what the top 15 conditions are and what could be dug into further, or what maybe you want to test in your system. And so we've got very common ones of hypertension or urinary tract infections and whatnot. And so there's a lot of really nice detail. And as we go further, we'll get to, like, we're going to publish the full MimicFire data set. So there'll be tons of conditions because we're talking 300,000 patients instead of 100. But this is the openly accessible data that eventually we'll get into credential data for the full data set. And so if we look here, one of them that we could dig into is atrial fibrillation. It's to deal with a irregular heart rhythm. And so what if we wanted to look at male patients with atrial fibrillation? You could pull that out, and you could grab a full cohort if you wanted, and pull that out there. So right now we only have about 15 patients with atrial fibrillation. The rest don't have it. But we can start looking into those patients and see, okay, if they've got atrial fibrillation, what kind of medications are they using? And then you can start, look, this is just trying to show just the different data that you can get out of MimicFire. And so here what you'll notice is a lot of the data is fluids. The top data will always be fluids because these are all hospital patients. They're in the ICU. They're going to be getting fluids. But then as you go down the list, you can, if you know atrial fibrillation, you'll know that metoprolol and amiodarone are the two of the most common drugs used to treat it. So then you can look and see, okay, so the patients that use metoprolol versus amiodarone, like maybe you can see which ones had better outcomes. This is kind of just showing the different extent to the data that you can use there. As well, we can look at different procedures that these atrial fibrillation patients might have. And again, there'll always be a lot of common procedures here where you're going to get people getting IVs, arterial lines, but with an atrial fibrillation patient, you would expect to get EKGs to really check their heart and see how it's doing. And so we've got a lot of interesting information here that can be pulled out for different procedures. And then just a couple last ones to show the overall data for lab events and show kind of the high-level labs. And this is, with labs, you're looking more at someone's glucose levels, the creatine levels. And so this query takes a little bit longer because the lab events is one of the bigger data sets we have here. And so we'll just let that run its course. Oh yeah, there we go. And so we can see kind of the initial information is a lot of standard glucose, potassium, sodium, and then different blood cell counts and whatnot. So you can see that there's a lot of lab information that you could pull through. So if you're looking at a lab system, you could go through and test passing through patients' white blood cell counts and see if your system can handle that. So it gives a lot of different options there for lab testing. I know in Ontario there's a whole organization dedicated to just the labs. As well, the microbiology tests. Again, this is a source of really complex data and useful to dig further into. And so one of the most common will be the urine culture here, but we've got the MRSA as well as blood cultures. And so you've got those more common ones, but you can get down to more specific Legionella, urinary tract. And so it gives you kind of the breadth of data, and you can start testing different edge cases potentially in your FHIR system, as well as looking at potentially different organisms and seeing how your FHIR system can handle it. And so this is kind of the first iteration of MimicFire, and we're looking to kind of keep building on this and take feedback from the community to see how it can get better over time. And so I will just get back to kind of my summary slide of kind of I went through kind of the basic understanding of Mimic, as well as the creation of the Mimic implementation guide. And we stepped through kind of that process of mapping Mimic to FHIR, as well as how to start using MimIC-IV-on-FHIR. So those notebooks are readily available, and you can access the data right now. It got published today, so you can start playing with those, pulling in those ND-JSONs into your FHIR systems, and then off to the races. And so I guess any questions at this point?
Into FHIR, or did you? I'm sorry. Yes, of course. Hi, virtual attendees. I hope you can hear me now. My question is whether there was a data loss when you brought the data into FHIR, and did you need any extensions to compensate for possible data loss? And I have a follow-up.
Yeah, we needed extensions because there was definitely the microbiology data. There was different dilutions and stuff that weren't captured, and so we've created quite a few extensions to make sure that that data is brought across to FHIR.
Okay, I think that's very valuable learning because there are many, many extensions being proposed in different IGs, and yet here's hospital data that actually has motivated some of those extensions, and it would be very interesting to see how the pool of extensions from existing IGs, at least in the clinical domain, you'd have to separate out the billing and so forth, but how those compare with the ones that you felt were driven, data-driven.
Yeah, so we did search for different extensions. I think it was mainly a lot of the microbiology data. There was missing components for extensions, as well as a couple pieces of lab components. So I think those were the two main extensions. I can link out to the different, the implementation guide. It's not quite live yet, but at this link, we'll have the full data available there.
One of the greatest challenges with de-identifying data is textual data. Are you taking that on at any point in time?
Well,
notes and
I guess that's something that we lean into. Basically, the MIMIC data set itself has already been de-identified, so this is kind of the step past it. So I work with Alistair Johnson, who's one of the creators of MIMIC, and so his work has been to do the de-identification in MIMIC. So the work MIMIC-IV-on-FHIR is working with already de-identified data, and so they're currently actually in MIMIC, they're working really hard to make de-identified notes is one of the big pushes they have. And so once they have that out, the hope would be, of course, to bring that into FHIR as well. Because yeah, that de-identification process is definitely huge with clinical notes, and there's so much value in those notes to get.
If I may interject, we have a question from Huva. Was there any consideration for mapping MIMIC-IV-ED to FHIR or just core hospital and ICU?
At this point, it was just the MIMIC core ICU and HOSP, and the thought was to do that ED mapping eventually. And actually, there's a collaborator here that I've just met that has done some MIMIC ED mapping into FHIR. So we're going to look at kind of making this canonical MimicFire publicly available. So Mimic ED is hopefully in the near future we'll have that going.
Thank you. Yeah, just adding to the question that was just asked about extensions. So I did this mapping MIMIC-IV-ED to FHIR. For doing that, I did not need any extensions. So that was just possible to do with the base FHIR resources. But of course, MIMIC-ED is a much smaller and simpler data set.
And you were able to capture all the components, like there wasn't anything of value?
No, not that I... No.
Okay.
No.
Yeah,
Yeah.
That's great.
Did you publish the IG? Is that online?
That we're working with MIT right now to get the URL to publish it. So we'll have that up in the coming week or so. So that'll be up soon.
If I may interject another question from our virtual attendees. There is one answer to it already in the Whova chat, but the question was, if the data available from MIMIC is real-world data and therefore PHI, how did it get approved to be available publicly?
Okay, yeah, so that's where the whole de-identification step has come in. So that PHI has all been stripped out. And I guess what I say, it's openly accessible to the public. The demo data set of 100 will be openly accessible, and then the full data set will be credentialed users, and that's kind of PhysioNet's setup. And so to become a credentialed user, you need to go through a training and sign off and say, I won't basically try and figure out who these patients are in this PHI.
And one more question from our online crowd. Do you think that the experience gained with MIMIC can be synthesized in a method that can be reused in other scenarios?
There's definitely a lot of lessons learned. I think this is a common process that people are doing, so I think that's an effort all around of how to take kind of an EHR and map it into FHIR. So I think it's something maybe I can work with other working groups and try and push this forward. But I hope that this process is repeatable, and we'll work with some collaborators with MIMIC-ED and see if we can make our processes the same and come across. So.
Seeing no other questions, thank you very much for your presentation,
All right.
and enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, thanks so much. Take care.